folks, welcome back to day 2 of the Center for Work and Democracy conference. We have a panel now on place, civic culture, and the right. We have terrific speakers, and I'm not going to intrude on their time, say to save. I think that this is a really important nexus of issues, and really too commonly we leave out the significance of place to building civic culture and confronting the political dilemmas in our society. We have a discussion in the media that is dominated by a not place-specific account or by very schematic and problematic accounts of lots of politics. So I think this session has potential to be really informative on that front. The same goes for organizing in unions and in other activist settings. Place is basic, but so are civic culture, and so are confrontations with opponents. Our presenters, I'm going to tell you all three in advance, are Monica McDermott, who will speak on From Cyber Ninja to Klansman, Right-Wing Attitudes and Midwest. Sasha Hillhorst, They're All Corrupt, How a Sense of Corruption Changes Politics in Former Labor Strongholds. And Rashad Shabazz, Prince, Place, and the Origins of the Minneapolis Sound. And then we'll by Marcia Howard mainly and me a little. Thank you. Monica.
Okay, great. I learned from yesterday. Thanks so much for having me here. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conference so far, so I'm really grateful to have a chance to share some of my research with you. So I'm going to talk about the results of some observations and interviews conducted primarily with middle-aged, late middle-aged, white working class men and women who exhibit a range of right-wing beliefs. Those who consider themselves simply Republican are juxtaposed to those who espouse more extreme views. In the latter case, local context exerts a powerful influence. And this is not just at the level of the city or community, but also at a kind of micro level of the space. In the cases I'll be talking about, a bar and a flea market. Oops. The two hard right groups I will discuss are, I'll call them anti-democratic, and the other one is stridently anti-immigrant. And these are two common characteristics of extremist groups on the right, of course. An anti-democratic group in suburban Phoenix was observed and interviewed last year, while a fiercely anti-immigrant group in Missouri was studied in 2017, shortly after the election of Donald Trump to office. As a number of social movement scholars and others have argued, perceived threats help to spur the development of local activist groups. And I should mention none of these, or neither of these, are affiliated with any national or larger scale organization. They're just located in the very particular site. In the case of the anti-democratic group, a sense that forces, were unnamed forces often, were targeting Donald Trump and his followers, which grew out of Trump's assertion of a stolen election. Anti-immigrant activists in Missouri were loosely organized by a former Klansman in response to the opening of a packing plant that employed a largely immigrant workforce. So the data I'll present today grow out of 3 distinct studies. The first one is comprised of interviews and observations with approximately 100 Arizonans in 21 and 22, not just white working class ones, but from different race and class backgrounds. The second study was conducted in 3 Midwestern cities in 2017, as I mentioned, although I'm going to focus primarily on interviews and observations conducted in Missouri. And finally, I'm going to very briefly present some findings from an original survey that's nationally representative that some of my colleagues and I conducted in 2020, just before the onset of the pandemic. So the anti-democratic group in the Phoenix area, flea market in a primarily white working class suburb. The central area of the market, which was near the concession stand, was the gathering place for the members of the group, about half of whom agreed to be interviewed by me. The remainder allowed me to observe, although one man was noticeably uncomfortable and would often leave when I arrived. I initially visited the market not with the intention of observing an extremist group, but in the hopes of being able to rent a booth so that I might use it to find people to interview for the study. The manager wanted to see my questions before he would allow me to rent a booth. And so when I showed him the interview guide, he said, "Oh, there are all these political questions on here? This is great. You can have a booth for free because I want my friends to be able to share their ideas with Arizona State." So I was being used apparently. And the location of the anti-immigrant group was centered in a bar in a white working class area of St. Joseph, Missouri, or St. Joe's as they call it. I was directed to the bar. I totally, unintentionally wound up in the bar because a man I met in a chain restaurant who I'd asked to interview. So you can't interview me, but I know the guys that you've got to talk to. They're in this place. Gave me the address of the bar, which was very difficult to find. So when I showed up at the bar, this was in the middle of the afternoon, everything stopped inside and everyone stared at me. The bartender gruffly asked me what I wanted to drink, and I picked the only beer on tap, which was Busch Light. The bartender then mixed my beer with water, saying, "You won't say anything to your bartender now, will you?" Since Busch Light and water are virtually indistinguishable, I quickly drank it down and was about to leave when the man I had met at the chain restaurant entered through the back door and said, "Monica, it's so good to see you," and gave me a big hug. At this point, I was in, and I learned an awful lot about this anti-immigrant group. So after I conducted the interview with Cyber Ninja, more on that in a moment, in the anti-democratic group, the group leader, the manager of the flea market, welcomed me to that side of town, suggesting that the East Valley location of Tempe was sheltered from the perspectives of those in the white working class community the members of the group lived in. Perish the thought. The group centered in the bar in Missouri thought of themselves as being from St. Joe, not any particular community within it. The packing house exerted a dominant influence. One interviewee emphasized just how far away from Mexico St. Joe was in the context of complaining about language instruction and local schools. I should say that in Missouri, immigrant and Mexican is used virtually interchangeably, although occasionally they'll discuss Muslims. The anti-democratic group that met at the flea market was organized and powerfully influenced by this manager of the market, who led a Sunday worship service each week before the market opened. And he had no training, he just sort of independently led this service for about a dozen of the members of the group. And there was surprisingly very little discussion of religion or Christianity among the people in this group. There's one person who I'll quote in a moment who talked about religion quite a bit, but he was unusual. So the cyber ninja of the group was not the leader. He was instead a man who had been actually somewhat marginal to the group before he joined up with the cyber ninjas to recount the ballots that were filed in Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is located. At this point, his status really increased. And he did this, even though he lost a lot of revenue in his handyman job that he gave up to do this volunteer work. So another thing that kind of brought the group together is their regular target practice at a secluded location, not too far actually it's kind of far from the market, windy road thing. And this is, extremist groups tend to espouse violence, and they very much did, and would show off the guns and use them, although fortunately not on people that I knew of. So there was a 72-year-old, a 3-year-old, sorry, vendor named Randy, these are all pseudonyms, who said, "When I was younger, I believed there'd be another civil war, and I thought it was going to be black against white. I could see that happening. And now I can see it isn't. There will be a civil war. And what it's going to be is white Christians against everybody. And they're all coming for us." So it's this sense of being not just besieged, but of an imminent war, kind of apocalyptic vision. They're coming for the white Christians. Now, COVID really fed into a lot of the kind of conspiratorial thinking that the members of this group had. They did not sort of find each other via social media or any kind of online forum. But once they were in the group, there was one member, the Cyber Ninja, who was quite skilled with it and used Discord and Telegraph and also YouTube, and sort of showed the others how to use these sites. And Rose, a 65-year-old cashier, gives an example of this conspiratorial thinking. So they, and this means the government, did say they knew about it, meaning COVID, a couple of years ago. But I think they wanted to get rid of all the old people. Social Security, we don't pay them anymore. And I really believe that they are weeding us out. But that's like everybody's going, oh, conspiracy theory. And I said, I just believe. Can you not see it? That's what blows my mind. They've scared people. And that's what they want. They want you to be afraid. They want you to be afraid, and you know what else? And you're a professor. They don't want us educated, really, either. And here it's the government writ large, no individuals, that are trying to basically wipe out their minds and their bodies. So Stewart, a 59-year-old carpenter, said, the government says they don't keep track of your vaccinations. They went to this household, and this is supposedly in South Carolina. He got this from, I think, Telegraph. We have records that show that you don't have anybody in your household immunized for these vaccines. And we want you to do that. They didn't force them to get them right then, but they hunted them down, right? They didn't visit them and ask them to get vaccinated. They hunted them down, and they could hunt down you or I. Now, these might be things to kind of maybe smile and shrug at if it weren't for the desire to actually murder people. And Keith, the 67-year-old handyman who was the Cyber Ninja, said, I'm going to take down anybody who's violated the Constitution. And the Constitution had this kind of hallowed place in the minds of this group. One day when they're sitting around talking, one of the people says, well, I tried to Google the Constitution this morning, and they've taken it down. And another person said, yeah, that's right. I tried to find it too, and it's not there anymore. All the links are gone. So this is like this document is a big deal. Little understood though it may be. And then Randy, the vendor we heard from before, said, we see that there's going to come a time when whatever food we have, somebody would be willing to kill us to get at our food and whatever we have. It's coming. Socialism. I heard that yesterday, actually. Eventually, communism. I can't see it stopping now. It's on its way. So people that never even thought about a gun are looking for some sort of protection. And a lot of them know that if there's a problem, they're going to come to my house. He sells guns, so he's prepared for this and will actually profit from this eventuality. So Rose, the cashier, said if we end up having to bug out and go live somewhere on our own, we're definitely prepared. I saw a gun once when I was a little girl. My dad had one. But we only saw it once and then they hid it. But I never held a gun or shot one until I came out here, and he took me up to the target practice area. So this is a woman who, by virtue of hanging out with this group around the concession stand, went from someone who knew nothing about guns, had never really even held one, to someone who now is able to shoot one with proficiency. So this is quite different, as you might imagine, from the things that the so-called mainstream Republicans say in their interviews. And one of these, almost by definition true, the references to violence are rare, are much less common. A couple of things, one thing that was much more surprising to me is that there was more focus on race, and especially the victimization, so-called victimization of whites, and discrimination against whites amongst the mainstream Republicans than there was between either extremist group. And then the domestic conflict, everyone talks about conflict, division, and many talk about civil war, regardless of race or class identity or party identity. But the Republicans talked about domestic conflict in a much more abstract way than others did. And give an example of this. So this is Wendy, we'll call her, a 54-year-old chef. The way it's been lately, it's bad to be white. And I don't understand why they're, in this case, it's people who aren't white, why they're trying to do to the country the way they're trying to do it. It's like they have an agenda. I know they have an agenda. So what do you think it is? Divide and conquer from within, destroy this country, break it down. And so here, very much this extreme vision of what's going to happen to the US, but it's not, she's not a part of this narrative, right? She's not going to fight to maintain the country or the like. Oops. And then Brooke, a 58-year-old homemaker, when asked, what are some of the biggest problems facing the country? She said, I think we're divided. I think we tend to group together, and I think that's detrimental. I don't think that's helpful. I think we need to disperse more. She pauses. So then she's asked, well, why do you think that hasn't been done so far? And she said, I think people who live on welfare are kept there. Where did that come from, right? She's talking about people need to disperse more as a way of bringing us together. And then suddenly she's talking about how, people on welfare are told this is how you're going to be, and they don't try or strive or work their butts off, right? And of course, welfare being a very racially coded term. So these things are melded in the minds of many, not all, of the mainstream Republicans we interviewed. And so the Klansman of Missouri, he's sort of not a Klansman at the time that I spoke with him, but had, admitted / professed to being one in the past and promised that he was no longer one. Yet his ideology very much persisted, his racist and anti-immigrant ideology. He was a very charismatic figure, and the other people in the bar, which is where he hung out, really looked up to him. And in the bar, as well as in the market, there weren't a lot of network contacts going out from these places. It was all very much sort of micro-localized. And it was true with him too, in terms of the people he had that he convinced to initially campaign for Trump. And they had all either not voted or voted for Obama. And then it became a little bit more intense. And the sort of images of violence and the prescriptions of violence and his assurance that he has friends in the forces who want to wipe out the immigrants just like we do. Okay. So one example of this. So it's the one union member I'll present a quote from. This is Grace, who's a 60-year-old factory worker. She says, those foreigners, they need to stay the heck out of here. We need to straighten our own house up before we can help anyone else. We can't expect to have all these foreigners to come in. And how are we going to mix that cake? How are we going to mix all those people? We're not going to bake that cake. I'm sorry. It's going to be a lot of killing, a lot of shootings, and hurting people, terrorism. And more of the same. I think I'll scooch ahead to the next. So this is a sort of mainstream Republican. I don't know how mainstream he is. He said he was a Republican troll. And you always wonder, who are they? Well, they're living in St. Joseph, Missouri. And there's this apocalyptic language about immigrants and violence and this sort of imagery. And here with him, we see again the turn to race. When the question is about immigrants, it becomes a response about Hispanics, and then a comparison between Hispanics and other racial groups. And again, this sort of aggrieved white man position. So the colleges and people look at them, meaning Hispanics, differently. They all get different funding to have those people there, just like any business in town. Of course, they actually get more money to hire Hispanics than they do a Black woman, probably. An Hispanic woman, they would probably get a little bit more for her. A Hispanic disabled woman, I'm sure they would get quite a bit for her. So, I mean, absurd, but makes the point. Okay, one last bit of data. So you can talk about interviews and the 12 people here and the 8 people here all you want, and it would be fair to say, well, this is just an aberration, right? What does this truly represent? And so this data is from a survey that my colleagues and I administered that is meant to be nationally representative. It was about 3,500 people. And we included, it's this posse scale, it's called, from Altemeyer. And I actually thought about, this is ridiculous. No one's going to say yes to these last couple of questions. And my colleague assured me, yes, they will. Yes, they will. And so 7% of Americans say they would participate in an attack on illegal immigrants if supervised by the proper authorities. Now, 7% sounds small, but it translates into 23 million Americans being willing to physically attack so-called illegal immigrants. And an even, I think, intensely harsher version of this is respondents were asked, do you support executing illegal immigrants? And 6% said yes, although somewhat reassuringly, only 2% of Arizonans. There were about 100 people from Arizona in the survey. That's about the only good news there. So is there any hope at all? This has been a grim presentation. Yes, I would argue. And am I out of time? Sorry, no more hope. Yeah. No, I know. I was kidding. So the 3 cities that we did interviews in the Midwest, we categorized into people in 3 different categories based on the way they talked about their own social class identity and position in the American hierarchy. And we found that about 50% of them fit the stereotypical white working class Trump supporter, right? This sense of superiority, often identify up rather than down, and have very negative views towards immigrants and people who are not white. That leaves 50% that don't fit into that category. 15% are very progressive, in fact, and have a kind of structural analysis of inequality in America. Union members, no doubt. And that leaves another third of the people that we interviewed, the 100 people we interviewed, which we actually replicated in the survey. A third of people in this weird kind of contradictory space that I think, and I think a lot of people who are doing organizing know about the people in this contradictory group and are trying to find the sort of points of leverage, who very strongly identified as working class, and even more so than American identity, but not in a sort of moralizing way or moral superiority way, but instead in this way that sort of talked about how America depends upon the working class. It would be nowhere if it weren't for the working class. And these folks actually had pretty consistently progressive attitudes on immigration. Racial prejudice was more problematic, but there's nonetheless room here that is quite a bit of room to shift the narrative so that the people I talked about today will be wildly outnumbered by the people who believe in a collective that includes all of us. Thanks.
For giving us that.
Thank you, Monica. That was fascinating, and thanks to everyone involved with the organization, because I've really been enjoying all of this so far. Let's see whether this is working. So, are we all set up? Should I click anything? Yeah, no worries. So I'll tell you who I am. So I'm here today to talk about my doctoral research in England, hopefully providing some thoughts and insights from across the Atlantic. So I'm a sociologist and a political ethnographer by trade, and I spent a number of months living in Mansfield, a former coal mining and textile manufacturing town, and Corby, which was the site of a large steelworks. And I was interested in how people made sense of politics, and particularly political legitimacy. And we know that citizens in towns like these tend to mistrust politics, more so than similar people in similar places. We can't quite explain it through economics. People who are very clever with very large surveys have tried. And combined, so this disenfranchisement and this political discontent, combined with the fact that these places tended to swing for Brexit very heavily, as did the two places I studied, has led some scholars to call this a geography of discontent, or this revenge of places that don't matter. And so I went there and I lived there for a period of time to try and understand what was going on. And I conducted 119 interviews with citizens, with community leaders, with their representatives, and spent a lot of time in quite similar bars and football clubs and other spaces. I'll argue that one of the dominant modes, one of the dominant frames through which people understood politics was through this frame of corruption, which was extremely, extremely prominent. And this frame isn't directly determined by the economic changes that have taken place in these towns, though it did very much relate to it. There was this system of gift and obligation that tied people to politics, and as that declined, it left this deep sense of corruption in its wake, with really severe consequences for the possibility of progressive politics in these towns. That, in a nutshell, will be my argument, and then I'll draw out some implications for strategy and the like. I wanted to start us off. Yes, this was a funeral I attended. Which is always a bit of a dream for an ethnographer. I'll start off with Donna. She was 42 years old. She was a mother of two. She worked as a teacher. Her partner was a nurse. And I spoke to her for hours, and she was telling me about how much she cared about inequalities in education. She said that was the policy area she cared about most. She came from a coal mining family. She strongly identified as working class. And so, in a way, this is a sort of you'd expect a very traditional Labour voter, right? But I can see on your faces, you can already tell that that this is a trick question. She'd voted Conservative in the most recent elections, and by the time I interviewed her, she said she would absolutely never, ever vote again, because it was all corrupt. So she said, whoever's actually pulling the strings is telling them, being the politicians, this is what they've got to say. I feel really sorry for Boris Johnson, you know. Yeah, he's the prime minister in name, isn't it? But I don't think for 1 minute that he makes any decisions. I think he's just a mouthpiece for it all. I don't know, I just think whoever's paying the money for whatever agenda they want him to push at that moment, it just feels like everything's just built on lies. You never really know what's going on. But I feel that's worldwide as well. You know, I just think the corruption is massive. And at this point, I think it's worth pausing to understand what people meant by corruption. Because when I talk to people about this, about half the people I speak to will say, "Oh, this is obviously false. There's not evidence that Boris Johnson can't make any decisions, that his every word is dictated by moneyed interest, etc." And then the other half of people I speak to say, "Well, this is obviously true. There's deep problems in political system, There's these worrying connections between high net worth donors in the Conservative Party and the like. But those specific types of analyses were, for the most part, not what people were talking about when I interviewed them. It was a much more diffuse sense, much less tangible. This sense that cash was exchanging hands and that regular people didn't have a voice at all. And sometimes this was fostered by sort of fringe news sites or social media pages, but this frame resonated far more widely than just a peripheral group of conspiracy theorists. To understand people's disappointment with politics and their sense of illegitimacy, I think we need to understand what their expectations are of politics in the first place. And interviewees, I asked people this, and interviewees typically said that they expected politicians to fight for them, to care about them, and to care for them. And interestingly, people didn't speak so much about ideology or policies or competence. They talked about care and being cared for. And in a way, that makes sense because these industrial towns often develop these paternalistic forms of legitimation. So yes, you're doing dangerous, hard work down the pits or in the steelworks, but you receive care and community, or at least that's the promise. And drawing on archival materials and oral histories, we can see that that's indeed how the civic leaders in Corby and in Mansfield would defend their right to govern. They would say, yeah, I take care of the town. They would fight battles on their behalf, and in return they would receive their votes and support in union elections and strikes. And the towns developed sports facilities, swimming pools, social clubs, funded through comparatively generous block grants from central government and concessions extracted from the major employers. So that's the steelworks, the mines, the textile factories. And so many people I spoke to would say, yeah, and on a Friday night when everybody had received their wage packet, the town centre would be buzzing. So in terms of people gifting their vote and receiving these things in return, I don't mean to suggest that this is a sort of tit-for-tat exchange in the sense of you give me this, then I'll give you that. This is a social relationship. As Marcel Mauss points out in his famous essay on gifts, gifts establish this expectation of gifts in return. I give you a gift, and at some point you give me a gift, and this cycle of gift giving establishes solidarity and maintains dominant institutions. And if no gift follows in return, if I've given you a gift for your birthday, but for mine you give me nothing, then there's honor at stake. And at the same time, gifts are liable to be reinterpreted as corruption when they don't fit our idea of what is given, how, and when. Many people in Corby and Mansfield have continued to operate under this understanding of politics. They've given something quite powerful. They've given their voice. They've delegated their voice to someone, and they've received nothing in return. They could no longer receive the perks which could be extracted from the steel, coal, and textile employers. New employers were not as rooted in place as these previous industries had been, and could not be pressured through strike action as easily. In fact, when unions have tried to do that, the employers have just upped and left, as did, for example, Oxford University Press, which used to run a warehouse in Corby from which it distributed many of its books. And they closed the warehouse and moved it elsewhere. So these new employers offered work in healthcare, retail, or warehouses, often on insecure and ill-paid contracts. And meanwhile, reforms to local government instigated by Margaret Thatcher significantly limited the ability of local government to build or provide on its own. And so instead, local leaders became dependent on these grant-based schemes to bring in mobile multinational companies. My interviewees didn't really like that either. This is John, who says, politics is like a game of Monopoly, and nobody can accuse the others of cheating because they're all doing the same thing. We see these changes with the demise of these old industries. And as one of my interviewees told me suddenly these old union leaders are traveling to India, they're traveling to China to bring in businesses to Corby. And as Tim, my interviewee, said, they were just swanning about having a good time. And in other words, when sort of representatives stopped conforming to these social expectations of residents, people assumed that they were doing that because they were serving themselves, because they were, looking out for number one, as it were. At the same time, to ensure the viability of towns like Corby and Mansfield after the disappearance of their major industries, local leaders came to prioritize competence in making these towns attractive for mobile capital and high-earning, highly educated current or future residents. Many of the council members that I spoke to spoke all the time about the highly educated professionals that they were going to bring in at some point. So they weren't catering to the actually existing constituency in their town of ex-coal miners, ex-steel workers and their children. They were catering to this hypothetical constituency of people who could help bring new businesses to the town and would generate revenues and would help the town survive. This depoliticized, competence-based approach to politics was incompatible with what most of my interviewees considered good representation and good politics and having a voice. They continued for a while, at least, to gift their votes and their voice, but they were not receiving what they wanted in return. And this they called corruption. And it highlights in part also that forms of legitimation are also points of potential challenge and vulnerability. If people in power say, I deserve to govern because I take care of you and I look after you, then that opens them up to a challenge of someone who, in an equally morally charged way, says, well, no, actually, you take care only of yourself. And this particular challenge in Corby and Mansfield was very effective at reducing people's support for the political system and the politicians who represented them. But it also made them feel like there was nothing they could do. So there was a lack of legitimacy, but also a great deal of acquiescence. So we've gone from, these mines and these steelworks, which were to an extent able to provide a form of stability and at least a limited extent of legitimacy. And instead now we've got new companies. This place was built as I was in the field, which was interesting in its own right. And most councillors I spoke to considered it a great victory. So where do we go from here? There's this emerging orthodoxy among campaign professionals on both sides of the Atlantic that what really needs to happen on the left is to back popular policies. And I think, we could do much worse than backing popular progressive policies. But at the same time, this promotes this view of citizens as these clusters of opinion. And as long as you optimize for what they want most, then you'll win the votes, and that's how campaigns are won. But this neglects the fact that for a lot of the people I interviewed, engaging with politics at all in any way felt humiliating. There's this problem of representation that's not dealt with there. When politicians made proposals that would radically alter the lives of the people I interviewed, proposals that would very much benefit them, they often felt that politicians were just saying whatever to get into power. And I mean, for good reason, because they've been let down before. And at the same time, when politicians didn't make big proposals, that just reaffirmed people's sense that nothing could ever change. So you're caught in a bind there. In fact, I'll skip to the next slide briefly. This was Georgina, who I spoke to, and we were talking about Labour's manifesto. And she was saying, I suppose it's all the same, isn't it? You know, I mean, you don't really trust a politician, do you? I mean, come on. I mean, I don't even think they can lie straight in bed. That was a favorite joke. This came up all the time. And she goes on to say, I think, sometimes I think these people, they say what they think we want to hear, and I find that quite annoying. It's as if they think we're thick, but we understand a lot better than they do. So there was this extremely tricky politics of promises where on the one hand, people really wanted to believe that things could be better than this. And they felt deeply that things weren't working as they were. And yet when there were big plans or utopian visions, they felt they were being taken for a ride. So this then is the challenge. So this whole civil structure that connected people to politics has mostly disappeared in Corby and Mansfield. Like the social clubs are gone, the football pitches are gone, the pubs in large part are gone. And the gap between people and their representatives must be filled somehow. People don't succeed in forcing their representatives to listen to them, thinking about these educated professionals that will definitely come into town one day. And so, yeah, the gap between the two must be filled. And that's in part where organizing comes in, which is obviously easier said than done. And also, what's required are these radical policies that are anchored very much in common sense in people's everyday experience. But for that to even be possible, progressive organizations need to be in these places so that they know what counts as common sense for a mother of two in a Mansfield cul-de-sac. And at the moment, they're not there. In the conference so far, we've been talking about pessimism and optimism and the like. And I do feel a degree of optimism from talking to a lot of these people. These places, they're still really strong labor values. People talk about work and pride in work all the time. There's definitely a seed of possibility here, but that's also a seed that has to be nurtured. So thank you very much.
Do I have to point it at the, oh, okay. All right, afternoon, everybody. I was dreaming when I wrote this, so forgive me if it goes astray. All right, there we go. That line from a song we've all partied to, danced to, mourned to on April 16th, 2016. And it is a song that is forever tied to the Minneapolis sound. The Minneapolis sound has been described as the combination of rock, funk, rhythm and blues, rock, funk, rhythm and blues, and punk. And its chief practitioner, high priest, and most astute practitioner of the form was Prince Rogers Nelson. That combustible mix of sounds that has defined multiple generations and is scattered over 44 studio albums, 44 studio albums. And if I can just provide a little bit of context, most professional musicians never complete their 6-album deal. The vast majority never complete their 6-album deal. The great Tribe Called Quest, for example, and so many others. And Prince Rogers Nelson completed 44 studio albums. But that combustible mix of pop and sonic thunder that we have danced and grooved to and has defined multiple generations has a deep and painful and bloody past. So the book that I'm working on right now, which is titled Biography of a Sound, Prince, Place, and the Hidden History of the Minneapolis Sound, which will be out this time next year, traces the emergence and the development of that sound through the geographic forces that gave rise to Minneapolis and to the various racialized communities in that city. And today I'm just going to talk about one part of it. The Minneapolis sound actually gets its start in the middle part of the 19th century as white settlers began to descend upon the icy banks of the Mississippi River. Indigenous people who had lived there for thousands of years were violently removed, and against the backdrop of that removal, white settlers created a music scene to bond the various different ethnic groups, Norwegians and other Scandinavians, with Northeasterners. And I won't talk too much about that today, but I want to talk about the second part of that, the creation of that scene, which really begins at the dawn of the Great Black Migration. As white supremacy and terrorism, along with Jim Crow segregation, forced Black people out of the South in droves, many of them moved to northern cities like Minneapolis. And two of those people who moved to those northern cities were Frank and Lucille Shaw, who were from a small town in northern Louisiana. These are Prince's maternal grandparents. You can really see it in Lucille. I mean, like, look at that face, look at those eyebrows. That's her grandson very much. Here's an image of baby Prince with his mother, Maddie, on the left, his maternal grandmother, Lucille, in the middle, and grandfather, Frank, on my right. When Black people move up to Minneapolis in the years right after the First World War, they are forced into apartheid housing conditions. Those apartheid housing conditions were essentially shaped by a set of policies that guided how home lending was governed. In the 1930s, the United States government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation issued a series of mandates that determined where loans should be given based on a color coding system, which I'll go to. I want to go back and forth. Keep going. There we go. Color coding system. So this is a map of Minneapolis from about 1940. It's in the early 40s, late 30s, early 40s. And this color coding system determined where banks in Minneapolis should provide loans. Systematically, in Minneapolis and across the country, Black neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that were transitioning from being mostly white to being immigrant to being Black were excluded from home ownership. This effectively removed the wealth generating productivity of home ownership for millions of Black Americans. If you look at it overall, 98% of home loans given between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the 1970s went to white communities, 98%, leaving 2% for Black and other communities of color. Okay, I want to go back. But prior to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, violence ruled as the major mechanism by which segregation in Minneapolis was constituted. Beginning in 1909, and extending all the way up until the 1940s, white residents in Minneapolis used violence, intimidation, poisoning dogs, setting homes ablaze, bats, knives, and even attempts to buy out Black homeowners to push them into two parts of the city. And those two parts of the city are North and South Minneapolis. And South Minneapolis is where George Floyd Square is, where Marcia is doing her organizing. Those two areas became the bedrock and the foundation for Black Minneapolis. You can see from this map in 1910, you can see the distribution north, not too far from downtown, what's also sometimes called the near north side, right along the river. By 1920, you see that number and the percentage of the Black population growing, as well as in the southern part of the city. By 1930, that number continues to grow. And here is where the Homeowners Loan Corporation really comes in and begins to systematically organize the distribution of Black people geographically in the city. The reason this matters in terms of the Minneapolis Sound is because as Black people are pushed into North and South Minneapolis, those become the locations for the production of Black politics, as Marcia has been talking about and will probably talk more about, but they also become the site for the creation of Black cultural networks, and particularly a Black sound begins to emerge from those places. I want to go back one more time. So as Black people are leaving the South en masse between the First and Second World Wars and taking train lines up to Minneapolis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Newark, and various other places, they are bringing many things with them. The history of resistance, histories of trauma, but for our purposes today, they are also bringing sonic forces with them. They are bringing with them, most particularly, the blues. Now, I know everybody in here has listened to the blues, has heard the blues, dances to the blues, and loves the blues, but the reason that the blues is so important to the creation of the Minneapolis Sound, and really to the creation of Western popular music, is because when you cut everything away from the blues is based on a simple formula. Chords in constant rotation with a fourth chord turnaround, and that allows for individuals that allows for other musicians to join into the chorus. Every bit of popular music you have ever listened to, whether it is the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, George Michael, Jay-Z, or Beyonce, uses that four-chord rotation. It is the aquifer of Western popular music, and it shapes every single genre in the West. That structure moves out of Texas and Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, and begins to move to all of these northern cities, including Minneapolis. So by the 1940s, Minneapolis has two music scenes. There is a Black music scene in the north, the near north side. There is a Black music scene in the south. That Black music scene is bathed in the logic of the blues, four-chord rotation that allows for space for other musicians to come in and to improvise. There is also jazz, which is being played in those locations, and it is a blues-inflected jazz, as that is borrowing from that blues formula of the four-chord rotation. There is also early rock and roll, and there are the early tenets of what come to be known as rhythm and blues, or R&B. And then there is a downtown white music scene that is jazz standards from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, less blues inflected, as well as other kinds of Minneapolis ethnic music, Norwegian polkas, and other forms of music. These these two forms of music that are governed by an apartheid system that shapes the housing network, the distribution of where Blacks and whites are located, subsequently produces multiple forms of cultural production. And specifically, they produce two different types of sound. How am I doing on time? Perfect. Okay. The Minneapolis sound, as it begins to grow into rhythm and blues in the 60s, rhythm and blues and funk in the 60s, which becomes the music that is located in North and South Minneapolis, is also seeing the growth of an indie rock and punk scene downtown. So whereas in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, downtown was sort of jazz standards, sort of local ethnic music that was racially white, and North and South Minneapolis had blues and jazz. By the 60s, blues and jazz have been replaced by funk and R&B, and the downtown area is being replaced by growing punk and an indie rock scene. Prince's contribution and his significant role in the Minneapolis sound was his ability to cohere the disparate sounds of the city and to synthesize them into funky grooves and harmonic patterns that reflect the city's history of segregation and apartheid. So while we love Darling Nikki, 1999, Starfish and Coffee, and the thousands of songs that Prince Rogers Nelson created, those songs were constituted against the backdrop of a pernicious apartheid system that manifests itself in organizing where Black people were located, in organizing where the production of Black sound took place, in giving access to white musicians in the downtown location. And his ability to have what many musicians call big ears that could really bring those different kind of sonic forces together, really turn this kind of pernicious apartheid system into a symphony of harmony that radically reshaped popular music in the latter 20th century. I want to leave with a quote from Jacques Attali, I think that's, or Attali, I think it's Attali, yes. More than color or forms, it is sounds and their arrangements that fashion societies. And the Minneapolis sound is really an articulation of the way in which race and class manifest itself in place, and how a local 5'2" genius was able to create a powerful sonic force against the backdrop of that nightmare system. Thank you.
All right. Okay. I wasn't sure how they were going to do that. These three disparate papers, how that's going to relate to a community organizer and a union leader from Minneapolis. How is that going to relate to me? But if you don't know, my name is Marcia Howard. I am the first vice president of Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, newly elected, but I'm also a resident of South Minneapolis, and I am an occupier, protester at 38th and Chicago Avenue, now known as George Floyd Square. In May of 2020, George Floyd was lynched about 263 steps from my house, and it was filmed by a former student of mine. And I have been out there every single day since, other than when Dr. McCrory tells me to come up here and talk in Arizona. And so what I want to talk about and speak to is Monica, your brilliant work when you went and talked to people, white men mostly, but also women who felt marginalized, working class folk, who then seem to have slipped off to the edge of what we would call extremist views, anti-immigrant views, racist views. And I need people to know that that is not, it's a small amount of people, but that small amount of people can make a big impact, especially when they cross paths with people like me. During the uprising, the rallying cry was white boys on bikes, white boys on bikes. And the first thing that I organized in the wake of the uprising was my own neighbors doing water brigades because people were setting our homes on fire or putting debris and incendiary devices behind our houses. The type of young folk and even, not so young folk that were doing that, coming into the city and causing a ruckus or starting the boogaloo, were the type of people that you interviewed. In fact, 4 young men, to me anyway, I'm 49, walk in, they park their red truck and walk into the square. And we looked at the sticker on their truck and we were like, okay, they seem, all right, even though they were, rough and tumble white dudes in the midst of thousands of people standing there in solidarity and wailing and grieving. And they said they wanted to teach us to do live fire drills. And I'm like, live fire? Unbeknownst to them, even though I was still wearing, J. Crew statement necklaces and an A-line skirt, I'm also a retired Marine. So I'm like, you want to fire ARs here at 38th in Chicago? Let's talk. What's your name? And then I got their names. And then they went away. And then I went to their truck. LGBT sticker on their truck. All right, that's reassuring. And then I looked closer, and the L had the Statue of Liberty. The G had a gun. The B had an American flag with a thin blue line, and the T was for Trump. I turned right back into the square, and I and some of my comrades wrangled these men up and said, babes, y'all gotta go. You ain't gotta go home, but you gotta get out of here. And the entire square, multiracial, multi-ethnic, various religion, thousands of people, we all walked. We got it on video. It's one of the most epic moments of my life. And we kindly walked them out of the square. Later that night, one of those young men was the man seen on national news firing his AR into the 5th precinct, just did a barrage of rounds into it. And then later they all got federally indicted for trying to sell fake weapons to Hamas in order to buy real weapons in the United States to start the Great Boogaloo. Now, when we talk about the Boogaloo Boys and when we talk about people that seem to be these small, insular, right-winged, working class Joes, we also have to talk about the fact that they're not just relegated to the pubs and the flea markets. They're also on Discords and they're also on 4chan. And they are spreading that ideology where they are very much beleaguered. They have this gnawing sense of being disconnected and being replaced. And then they come into George Floyd Square, which seems to be this international beacon of, Black power and solidarity, with the fist there. And then I have to physically fight them. So they are not innoxious, and not that you suggested that they were, but just because they're small in number, these are people's sons that are in basements doing this. These are people's brothers, cousins, sisters, aunts that are sitting at bars talking about this. And even if we were to ear hustle and overhear them and we say, oh, they're crackpots or they have a legitimate beef, but they're not going about it the right way. If they were right wing or if they were Republican and were less bent toward violence, then we would be, I'm saying, and I'm arguing that we have to put measures in to get them to see things a little bit more to the left, because if they stew in this sense of being ostracized and not considered, because that's what you get, this sense that they don't count. And those people who sit there and they think they don't matter anymore when they've spent their entire life being told that they matter over much. How do you get told day after day, you the man, and they don't have any idea of their own power? Let's be honest, wealth, money is portable personal power. And without that, then it's weaponry. It's weaponry that's portable personal power. What is power? The ability to affect change. Them on their own, they cannot. They don't feel that they can until they see that very juvenile cause and effect. Even a toddler, I have this on the desk, I push it off. Even a cat, I can knock that off. And they are finding a way amongst themselves to affect change. And I think it's foreboding the type of ways in which they think they're going to do it, the great boogaloo. And what's really interesting, I like your observations about how somehow it's not as racialized as you would think, even though it's anti-immigrant sentiment, that they have these like specters of being replaced by these people that are imported in, right? But I think one thing that we should be wary about, these are people we know. These are people who work beside us. These are people who are ostensibly neighborly folk. They're not sullen and these are people we know, y'all. They are. And it's really, really important that we start, gauging, how much in community folks are. I think that's the only way that we can countervail that, by bringing them into community. It's awkward. It's weird, right? That we're saying, I'm like, I picked the boy most likely to shoot me to talk to. And I don't mean that facetiously. I'm not being sarcastic. Where we are at 38 in Chicago, we've had incursions by people intent on harm. Sometimes it's to property and sometimes it's to people. And at 38th in Chicago, we walk, talk, or move around. And a lot of time it's just walking and talking. Yeah, that's a whole thing. And it relates to what Sasha was studying in Corby and Mansfield, simply because there are a lot of people, working class people, who've they've breached faith and trust with elected officials. And with your observations of why they don't trust officials. I'm one of those people who would argue, well, they're not wrong. It is corrupt all the way down. They say it's turtles all the way down. No, it's not. It's grift all the way down. However, what I've observed in South Minneapolis is there are ways in which corporate entities, that money that they think is suspiciously is directing people, in a way it kind of is. It is very telling that it was Amazon that you chose. When I'm in the square, I once had an East African, and I say once had, this was 2 weeks ago, right before the election, an East African young man walk in and he says, "You're not voting for Ilhan Omar, are you?" And I'm thinking, "You're Somali, hey," and he's like, "No, none of us like her anymore." And I know that was demonstrably untrue, but it was very interesting that he chose to seek me out and let me know this. I say, go on. And he had the same reasons. She's only for herself. She just wants to be on TV. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, y'all, there was an entire conservative campaign to undermine her election and get someone who's a Don Samuels ain't shit. And that's who they wanted to be elected. And actually, I'm going to disclose something. Someone had walked to me and said, "Why don't you run against Ilhan?" And then I realized that there was an entire campaign to sort of fan the fire of apathy and disenfranchisement among the working class Somali folk, right? And I'm like, to what end? Why would they want them to feel this way? And I'm just running this through my head. If you're not aware, there's a corporation in south of Minneapolis, Amazon, who put a billboard at George Floyd Square about a month ago. It's the first non-George Floyd Square, non-George Floyd related billboard in the square. And it was Amazon celebrates Somali Week. And we're like, it's been 2 years. We have not had a commercial billboard in this square, but that was the billboard. And I'm like, wasn't there rumblings about Amazon organizing in Savage, Minnesota? And what I'm going to say is this: if someone were of the mind to go to Corby and Mansfield, move there and start learning about the folks there, because I don't think you can go there and try to impose your will. But if you were to go there and be a part of that town and start finding a way to organize those folks around even their sense of loss and apathy, and start building that efficacy within themselves, I think they could have a powerful, organized workforce back again, which to me would make them better workers for whatever corporation that they lured back into their town. I think an organized group of workers, people with that sense of self and pride in work and pride in community, makes a better town. But I'm not sure whether or not that it's a desirable place to be. It looked lovely though, it really did. I do know in Minneapolis, there's a lot of organizing going on right now in the wake of all of our protests. People got that F around and find out fervor. And so store after store after store is attempting to unionize. Now, with that said, that movement is going to need a lot more, but I like the fact that young people who, we don't even like use the term activists. They're just, Minneapolis is just on fire that way. They don't distinguish between the activism part and the labor action part. It's just one big thing. It's just who they are and how they move into a space, which is very challenging as a high school teacher as well, because they come into every space like that. So prepare for that for those young folks. Remember, we had Jamar Clark, we had Philando Castile. They dang near came out the womb marching. That is what they do. They move collectively, they organize in the city that I'm in. I mean, Prince said that there was going to be a revolution in Minneapolis. He wasn't lying. He wasn't lying. And when we stand at that barricades, and if you saw the film yesterday from Flow State, where they looked at the free state of George Floyd, those purple jumping jacks that are there that protect me when I'm standing there from an oncoming car, those were donated by Paisley Park. Quiet as is kept, Prince Rogers Nelson from Minneapolis, Minnesota, spent years before his death giving money to social justice groups quietly. He never needed to get recognition. Matter of fact, it wasn't until Van Jones even said it after his death that people recognized that he was bankrolling organizations like BLM. But I do know that afterwards, members of his band, Jelly Bean, comes to GFS all the time, right? Like, people in the revolution actually support George Floyd Square with their bodies, with their presence, right? And that idea of our cultural landscape, we say at the square, bring your gifts to the square. We don't distinguish between how we hold space as activists and organizers and how we hold space culturally. On Wednesdays, we knit. On Mondays, the Brass Solidarity Band, and that is a collective. If anyone who's of a revolutionary bent and they play a brass instrument or a piano or the drums, they show up every Monday to hold space. Everything that we do at that intersection is an act of revolution. And the most radical thing that we do is hold each other in community. And so all three of you and the work that you're doing, and it's about listening to community, acknowledging their fears, acknowledging even the things that may give us pause, but they must be considered. Those are people, those are workers, those are voters. What is the thing that they are fearful of, and what is the thing that they are hopeful for? And a person who can get close to that and start listening and have those people feel heard is a person who can organize. That's a person who can actually affect change. And so thank y'all for your work. I truly, truly appreciate it. You should come to Minneapolis, 38 in Chicago Avenue in south of Minneapolis. That's where I am. Thank you.
So I promised to be brief, and I started by tearing down the set there. I want to make just a couple of quick comments and see if we have some questions. So, terrific panel. The theme of place did run through it all in various different connections to the issues of politics and of community. Here are my quick comments. I'm struck, and Monica has talked about many interesting points, including thinking about target practice, folks. And Monica talked about espousing violence, but she also let us know that this was something that could be experienced as empowerment, right? That this was people who said, I never had a gun, right? But also, didn't really have much power, much efficacy. I'm experiencing something. So there's an aspect of this story about guns in America that is about violence. There's an aspect that is encouraging fear. I mean, the first thing you get taught at a gun club or a range is you should be really afraid of all those people that you might have to shoot, right? But there's an agency, an empowerment issue there, which is important. The people that you talk about as anti-democratic activists and who hold the Constitution as sacred are really interesting. And I just want to note that this is something that has its theorists and its academics as well, and its constitutional lawyers, as well as its popular perception. And there is a strong set of arguments about the importance of our Constitution as distinct from our democracy, which I think we should be really worried about. They have a respectable intellectual lineage, but they are a problem because what is meant by them is that in order to maintain our Constitution, we should sacrifice our democracy. And people who might have said, or their ancestors might have said a generation ago, they were absolutely about protecting democracy, are saying something different, partly because of the fear of replacement. The fear that their future is that of being a minority, where a democratic majority could be a problem for them. And this change is deeply undermining. Now, in that context, one of the other themes in Monica's presentation that I thought was great was that each of these groups is defending a local. And they're defending themselves in some sense. They're not about grand visions of transforming American society, rebuilding it, this ideology, that ideology, or something. They are laying very strong claims to the local and to their own rights and lives, which are inextricably tied up with very specifically local, not local like Phoenix is local, local like a place in it. So powerful. Sacha, continuing the story, very different context and yet very similar context in the British Midlands, one of widespread displacement. Not that the people you were interviewing were displaced removed from the place, but that the place was taken away from them in an important sense, because the place was a community, the place was the union, the place was the mine, right? And so when those things are gone, right, the mere point on a map isn't the place. And this experience of displacement gets in the way of being able to say we just rebuild the union at the new workplaces because the new workplaces aren't in the town anymore. Right? They are miles away and people have become commuters instead of working close to home. They are in logistics industry, which is in the business of displacement in many ways at large scale. And there is, as you point out, a constant relocation away. So the Oxford University Press or whoever else, the mobility of capital. Now, I will just add, this is a hundreds of year old story because throughout modernity, it has always been the case that capital could move away from problematic workers whenever the workers were trying to hold capital some sort of account. But this experience then is one of disempowerment and no one cares. And this becomes the basis of this. We're getting a deeper understanding of a version of what will get called right-wing politics, but is a politics of disempowerment and of nobody cares in important ways. Rashad, this compelling story, finish this book, will you? I really want to read it. And I want to see and hear the movie that comes from it. But this great story, I want to pull just the connected theme out. The story of creating Black communities, right, out of segregation, out of being pushed into places in the North and the South in Minneapolis, is a story also of place-based institutions, which can be recording and clubs, and of course churches are part of this story and others, and sometimes schools, right? And all of this is inhabitation in these places, making possible continuity and innovation across generations and connections among places. So what you celebrate in Prince is both of those things, right? The history and the connections among different places, not simply progress or growth, not a narration of, oh, well, this is the growth of new popular music in America or something like that. There is no standard homogenizing story. It's a bunch of specific connections, which is powerful, I think. There is a certain illusion, if I read the story rightly, to the idea of culture or society in general. And this relates to many people's disillusionment with the project of achieving fairness only at an impersonal scale, of big institutions in society, of the system in some way, not in their lives with everything else. And here, Marcia, in this phrase, that the most radical thing we do is to hold people in community, bringing the problem folks into community, right? As distinct from abstract recognition. So we have a lot of politics about abstract recognition and what happens at large. This is about what happens in community, and it's powerful. Questions from the audience? Comments? Anyone against community out there? Against place? Cedric.
In describing the Great Migration, I mean, you're certainly right to point out the process of redlining white hostility or violence that produces segregated neighborhoods. But I'm also thinking that, at least in my own family's migrations out of Louisiana to California places, people oftentimes migrate in a way that follows, kinship bonds and neighborhoods are reproducing places. So I wonder how much that figures into the account of Prince and how people settle in Minneapolis aside from, white terrorism. So I'm wondering about that. I'm also wondering, the ways in which integration plays into Prince's story. Like, what's the type of music that he produced, especially in the 70s and 80s, which transgressed the boundaries that his grandparents and his father had to provide. How do you make sense of that? And I guess another part of it, I was thinking of in terms of musicians, and I should disclose, my dad was a tenor saxophonist, I was a musician as well. there's a way in which the society imposes certain restrictions on us. But in terms of musicians, I mean, we find influence and inspiration from everything, right? And whatever you do, like, that shapes you. So I wonder, like, how much the experience of you know, Minneapolis version of Jim Crow affects the shaping of Prince, and how much of it was also him rebelling against that and breaking through some of those boundaries. Not only him, but all the other musicians who were in Minneapolis who predated him.
Those are wonderful questions. Let me start with the last one. Oh, right. Hello? Okay. One of the reasons I find music fascinating is that it's a radically democratic practice. And the Black musicians in North and South Minneapolis were deeply invested in that democracy, as were some of the downtown white musicians. But the Black musicians were deeply invested in it, not only because of the aesthetics, the sound, but there was also something politically radical through synthesizing sounds across race and class and geography. And Black musicians were, on one hand, they also had to do it if they wanted to gig a lot, they had to be able to play other kinds of music. So they had to be able to play this kind of, top 40, downtown sound, even though they were oftentimes not allowed to play there. But Black musicians in Minneapolis, and I think Black musicians during this period of time throughout the country were invested in the radical politics, the transgressive politics of synthesizing music, because it opened up new sonic possibilities, but it also reflected a kind of possible future. And I think that Prince's music always had that in mind, whether we're talking about, For You in '76 or 1999 and 1982, or whatever, right? I think he always had that in mind. So for me, Prince and the Minneapolis sound is really about organizing sound in a way to give life to what we might be able to organize in our material lived experience. In terms of the first question, yes, as Black people are coming north and in places like North and South Minneapolis, it was the migrants, the first people who leave to come up north, and they end up pulling others into the neighborhood. The reason why white terrorism and the structural impediments play a role is that where those initial migrants went to, they were forced there. They couldn't go anywhere else. And as they pulled other family members up south or up north, they were all forced to congregate into these particular locations. Excellent question. I hope I got them all.
Builds on the other question, whether the sound is born out of resistance. We look at struggles in the South. The first instrument that you have is a voice, and the voice can be used, and it was used as a way to fight back. And then instruments are pretty simple. The drum that you can make. And so I think it was the community, but also from resistance that in the face of great brutality. So I think that sonic distillation and improvisation is constantly changing as positions change. But I think there is this kind of origin that's important as part of the movement.
Joel here, Heidi, speaking of sound and voice, because I'll just summarize it and then answer the question.
Okay, so the Heidi is asking about how sounds have a radical politic, and how that sound is organized is a kind of reflection of a politics. And this is why I find the Minneapolis sound so interesting, because it's not about, you know, when we listen to music and we think it's progressive or what have you, we look for lyrics, you know, like did Beyonce say this? Did Jay-Z say that? You know, did Bob Marley say this? And, you know, yeah, Redemption Song is great and radical and all of that, but there's a way that cohering different sounds is a reflection of a politics, is a reflection of an imaginary. And I think the Minneapolis sound is really unique in that way. That's very different from New York, which, you know, New York had a very specific kind of black and white sound, and so does Los Angeles, and so does Texas, and so on and so forth. But Minneapolis was really particular in that. And I think it is that ability to bring, you know, funk and punk and rock and R&B together, these sonic forces that are separated through geography and violence, and that ability to bring them together, absent of, you know, whether we're talking about dancing during the apocalypse or, you know, Darling Nikki or, you know, what have you. It's just that ability, that imaginary to bring them together that I think is really important. And for me, this is the kind of organizing, this is another kind of organizing, right? And this organizing, you know, it requires skill and desire and patience, but ultimately it requires vision and imagination. And I think that's what Prince and Jelly Bean Johnson and Morris Day and all the other folks, Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis, I think they had that vision and they manifested by creating the sound of Minneapolis.
Thanks for the presentation. So my question is for Monica and Sasha. So the question is about kind of these, you know, what institutions are kind of socializing or leading to these types of opinions and beliefs. And so Monica, your presentation, you focus on the flea market and the bar. And I'm curious, is that just a platform in which people kind of unite in the displeasure, or is there some type of socialization process happening in these institutions? And then Sasha, for you, I'm just wondering kind of the same, like, was there, you know, education system there, classes there that kind of led to this type of, you know, opinion, or is it some type of other maybe extracurricular activity that's leading them to kind of come together, to coalesce, to have a unified vision of what they want the future to be?
Super interesting in terms of, yeah, where are people getting these opinions, where are they being socialized into them, and the like. I spent a lot of time in community spaces of various kinds, and people in what was left of the old welfares would be talking about politics all the time. And I spent a lot of time at allotments, which were actually one of the few places where people were trying to build a new progressive politics, which was interesting because these are post-industrial towns, right? There's lots of land that isn't being used for anything. So the council was very happy to just have people do allotments there. That was actually one of the prime sites of left-wing organizing, where a real attempt was being made to organize the town in a different way, which was really interesting. On the other hand, with the decline of industry, you also get the armed forces coming in, very much recruiting people, so that becomes sort of a viable career for people. And there were spaces equally where former members of the armed forces would come together and talk about politics also, which tended to stray quite conservative. So you had different spaces within the town, definitely. But it's also a story of the falling away of lots of those spaces that were there to help people have a voice collectively and also to make sense of politics. Because a big part of like what you see in a lot of these quotes is people saying like, I just can't make sense of this. The only way I can make sense of this is somebody's out to get me somehow. And that may very well be true, but then it's still very helpful to have an analysis of who and how and through what means and how it might be challenged.
Thanks. Yeah, great questions. So this kind of takes me back to what Marcia talked about the very beginning of her comments about having, the truck full of young, violent white guys ready to attack. And there is, has been reported on quite a bit, academic and non-academic sources, large numbers of people like this who can be mobilized at the drop of a hat. And those weren't the people that I encountered or were studying. These were older people. None of them had kids at home. Some of them, were at least semi-retired. And the site in this place, and their online forays were almost supervised in a way, curated for them. And so I think for that reason, it's like a kind of over-socialization in these sites relative to the way institutions might ordinarily socialize people into political beliefs and praxis. And also getting back to your earlier comment about, and folks on the margin and so forth, we asked a question in the interview, has anyone ever expressed any concern for your well-being? And most of the people said it was health-related things, physical health-related things. There were two. One was a woman, Rose, the cashier, whose adult daughter was very concerned about her conspiracy theories that she's bought and was trying to learn. She's like, I'm not even speaking to her anymore. And then the cyber ninjas, brother and sister, were both doing the same thing, trying to talk him out of the conspiracy theories. And he was still in contact with them. But it's definitely the case that not only maybe are they starting on the margins, but they're pushing themselves even further out, away from the people that care about them.
Thank you. There. So this is a question for anyone who wants to answer, but it's prompted to me by Sasha and Monica's presentations. So organizing is like super retail. And so when you're thinking about how to respond to the kinds of things that you're learning about and bring people into community understood in some kind of democratic way, like we're collectively doing a thing, what does it look like once it's organized, right? So part of what, is it machine politics? Because that's a really effective way to re-engage this and create those relationships, but also then people are part of the thing and they work collectively. But sort of what would be, from what you've talked to people about and what you've observed, what would be what it would look like that would work? Not necessarily how we get there, although if you have ideas, we want them, but sort of what would it look like if it was working?
I think for that, I sort of refer back to the allotment almost, which had the most effective community organizer there that I'd encountered at any point in my work. And she was on the city council. She was totally unique in her outlook, in part because she'd lived a lot of this stuff. Her sister had been a heroin addict for a really long time. Her father was disabled after a mining accident, and she was just there trying to build community in the allotment. And when people had stuff that they didn't understand, they would come to her. They would say, "My sister's being evicted. What can we do to stop it?" And she would either refer them to someone else or she would do it herself. She was definitely a take no prisoners type. So at some point when the city's social housing organization was threatening to evict a family, she called up the relevant council member and said, "If this isn't solved by tonight, I'm going to the local paper and I'm letting them know you're responsible." And that was really good. And obviously it was very small scale. She worked with maybe 20 people, some of them formerly incarcerated. And she was building politics, and people would come up to the allotment all the time and they would say, "Amanda's a crazy socialist and I don't agree with her ever, but I vote for her every time." And that was really powerful. This was a space where people related not just to her, but also to each other, where they could make demands known, where they could seek clarification, where they would share stories. But in terms of how that relates to machine politics, in the time that I was there, Amanda was kicked out of the Labour Party for picking fights with other council members. And so in a way, this type of alternative organizing and machine politics, they bit each other. They didn't, the one didn't lead nicely into the other, but they ended up, being or the machine politics was very destructive in this case. But in terms of, yeah, my utopian vision is things like the allotment, but also, yeah, a pub or a community childcare space or these civic institutions where people can come together, because it's all been privatized, it's all fallen away. And yeah, where people can have communities where they can make sense of what's happening and where they've got an avenue that connects them into power, making demands known in various ways. So yeah, that's what the good version of it looks like to me. Oh, sorry, yeah, a community gardening project. So basically a whole big stretch of space, and they started off just with a very small patch, and now they've got a huge community garden where they grow vegetables together, which they then distribute to low-income households so they can have vegetables. But for the most part, a lot of the people there never did any gardening, as far as I could tell. They would sit there and then jokes about other people being not lazy, lazy, they would say. And while they were standing there, just sort of commenting. And Amanda would say, yeah, that's what they do. They love being here, and then they'll pretend to work, and then they don't. And that's great for them. They love it. And there was space for that too. Yeah.
So I just want to say quickly that one of the themes of this, I guess, is the sort of different scales of space and place, and the different ways that it leads us to think about things like solidarity and ideology. And for me, there was a certain oppressiveness to these little places that had tremendously strong ties between its members, a high degree of solidarity, but also very clearly, easily patrolled boundaries. So no one cared that these 12 people were going up in the mountains and shooting off their guns for a purpose hopefully very few would agree with. 92% of Americans would not agree with. And so trying to find this kind of sweet spot between porous boundaries and high degrees of solidarity would be the task. Now, how does one go about that? I mean, I like the allotment idea, but
You could get them to stay at an abandoned speedway that we now call the People's Way every single day. Every morning at 8 a.m. and every night at 7 p.m. we meet as a community. I think what you're describing, your allotment, it looks like what we call mutual aid. And so coming up with projects and ways of being that all is in service of each other, so that what we say is we all we got. And we act like that and we live into it. And then every other day, the city comes in and tries to sit in on our meetings, because what they want is us to be supplicants, hat in hand, saying, don't you need us again? But if we start taking care of our own issues, including a pothole that we can go get some Quikrete or we'll fix it ourselves. That is what happens at GFS. And it's been sort of like a model across the city, in fact, across the nation, of ways in which you can sort of take your town into your own hands. I think that is similar, but how it translates into political action, then you get to a point where people in politics want to come and sort of, campaign in front of your group. And I'm like, so are we unwashed leftist masses, or are we important? Because now, will George Floyd Square endorse a candidate? No, we just live here. We're just community members. We're not just community members. We know that. We know the power that we've been imbued with by circumstance and, frankly, by believing in who we are as people. That little small, and I'm talking small, we are one little corner of the world. But what we are showing is that collective action works, and it takes a high degree of, I want to say, arrogance. It's just not even that. It's just we determined each and every day that we were going to depend on each other. And I mean for mortgages, I mean for $900 tooth fill, all of it, we take care of it. Someone needs a new roof, we take care of it. We just decided to lean on each other. And then more and more people decided to join in with us. We all we got. And then you couldn't be apathetic about the political machine, because you're part of it now, right? You are part of it. So someone will go to the meeting with the city, to determine what the next police chief is going to do. It ain't gonna be me, but it's gonna be somebody. Somebody's going to do it. So in that way, they reach back out into those systems and see just how much they want to be involved or not. But right now, 2 years and 3 months in, we still get to determine what we are and aren't going to do. At any moment, though, we know that the city of Minneapolis or the county of Hennepin or the state of Minnesota can literally take a bulldozer and end it all. We've had our governor send the National Guard on us. Matter of fact, our rallying cry for elections was simply that I ain't voting for nobody who put tear gas on my face. Like, if you tear gas me, I'm not voting for you. That's the hard line, that right there. And that went viral because when people start thinking about it, who of these candidates have tear gassed us? And the fact that it was quite a few of them is very telling.
I would just say quickly that it looks like harmony, and making harmony musically is difficult. Ask any musician. It is very difficult. It's about attention to percussion and tempo and rhythm and how many notes are used. And it is a balance. It is a dance. It is a struggle. But it looks like what harmony sounds like, and that's why I think the Minneapolis sound is so incredible, because it is about the struggle over different sonic forces that were created through pain and suffering, and people who were determined to create and organize sound in such a way to make us shake our asses and to give us a possibility of what we can be. And so organizing harmony is difficult, and it is the kind of work that Marcia is doing every day. And it is really, really difficult, but it can be done. But I think one thing we do have to come to terms with is it's how difficult it is, and that it can be done, and that it must be done. And we need a little bit of courage and imagination. And so I would say, that kind of organizing, it looks like harmony.
So I'm conscious of Mudge here, and I can't resist saying one more thing. So I'm apologizing. Here you go. The thing is just that there's such a tension around place-based community, and the experience of place as a trap you want to escape from, who hasn't been 16 and trying to get out of a place that felt imprisoning, right? And the mutual commitment that comes from being in the same place and the same community of fate together. And this two sides of the coin is important to keep in mind, because it's easy to become idealizing. And in relation, say, to Monica's stuff, we need to remember that lots of these people who are defending place-based communities against liberals and socialists are defending place-based communities that are being destroyed by the young people moving somewhere else for jobs or a future. And the rising average age of so many communities in so many places is an index of community crisis. And we need the perspectives of the old people stuck there. We need the perspectives of the 16-year-olds who got the heck out too. So thanks everybody for being a part of this session, as well as the whole conference. Go get something to eat.